Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. Today's episode is a dive back in time. I always enjoy reading old newspaper archives, and the research for this episode took me on a long trip down the rabbit hole. Please note that as you listen, you may hear me refer to the victims and perpetrators via their surnames. This is purely to avoid confusion, as some of the individuals involved share the same first name. Now, let's head to the episode. Murders committed with the use of arsenic were rife in the 1800s and early 1900s. This coincided with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, where arsenic was frequently found in mining. Once considered a waste product, it soon found other uses and became a feature of the century due to its many applications. Arsenic became a popular commodity because it was readily available to everyone. In fact, a child could walk into a shop and purchase the deadly substance. The compound was also cheap, so it was affordable to most people. The use of arsenic was widespread, but its odourless and tasteless nature made it ideal for adding to food and drinks. As the Britannia stated, quote, "It has at different times been mixed with almost every article of food, with the bread on the breakfast table, the sugar in the basin, the meat, vegetables and pudding at dinner, with the tea at evening, with the beer at supper, with the gruel given to the sick, with the liquids handed to the thirsty, with the very medicine prescribed to relieve the intolerable pain caused by an insufficient dose. Death is certain, detection barely possible." As well as being readily available and often purchased as rat poison, the substance had a multitude of purposes. It was used in children's toys. Women would use it to lighten their complexion, as pale skin was seen as a desirable trait. The compound was also found in wallpaper, as it was discovered that it prevented colour pigments from fading, and was also found in various medicines. Not all poisonings were intentional, with occurrences of accidental consumption, as arsenic was sometimes confused with other products such as flour and daft. The latter was an often used sugar substitute due to sugar being an expensive commodity. One of the worst cases of accidental poisoning occurred in 1858, when a sweet manufacturer in the town of Bradford in Yorkshire inadvertently added arsenic to the mixture when making some humbugs. These were then sent to a confectioner on the local market, who unwittingly sold them to members of the public, resulting in 200 people falling ill and causing the deaths of 20 others. Upon an investigation into the incident, it was discovered that the sweet maker had placed an order of daft at the local pharmacy, but when they went to collect the order, the pharmacist was ill. However, he had sent someone to process the sale, instructing them that the daft was in a container in the corner of the storeroom. Sadly, this individual went to the wrong corner, and due to the container not being labelled, they unknowingly sold a large quantity of arsenic. A number of people were arrested and charged with manslaughter, but ultimately it was found to be a tragic accident, and all charges were dropped. During my research, I came across two cases that occurred in the same town, and although they took place 70 years apart, both shocked the communities. So today we are heading to the town of Ashton-under-Lyne, which sits roughly 6 miles east of the city of Manchester, and lies in the shadow of the Pennine Hills, which form a natural barrier between the counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire. The town boasts an undulating landscape, originally a rural land, ruled over by a lord of the manor. According to local legend, one such lord was despised by his tenants. He was a tyrant, cruel and unforgiving, who would traverse the area dressed as a black knight and punished innocent and unsuspecting people. When he was shot dead by his own son, the townspeople celebrated by having a black knight ride through the town. It is also believed that they would burn an effigy of the detested lord. Over time this has formed into an annual tradition in the town, which took place until the 1950s, and an attempt to revive it was made in 2005. To this day, as you walk the streets of the town, there are still references to this local legend. The area rapidly transformed during the 1800s, and the once primarily agricultural settlement began to give way to industries such as coal mining and weaving, the former bringing expansion to the area with the construction of 3 canals starting in the late 1700s. These would transport goods to the counties of Derbyshire and Yorkshire. Throughout the 1800s, the town grew rapidly, with people flocking to the area in search of work in the newly constructed mills, and this resulted in a large increase in both population and house construction. But the conditions were dirty and squalid, with drinking water procured from wells or from the River Tame which ran through the town. At the heart of the old town, sat in an elevated position, is the Church of St. Michael's. Although the one that stands today is not the original incarnation, a church has stood on the site since the 13th century, and it was here, on the 4th of July, 1808, that Susanna Smith married Matthew Holroyd, and within 4 months of their nuptials, the couple would return to the church to baptise their son, William. The family lived in the town and led what could be considered a mundane existence. It was alleged that their marriage was not a happy one, and that the couple were known to argue often. However, there was nothing exceptional about this family. They were just one of thousands that had come to the town in search of work, but still living on the verge of poverty. The family's unassuming status would change in 1816, when 3 deaths would stun the community. It started at the beginning of April 1816, when Susanna Holroyd went to see a fortune-teller. During the reading, the seer told her that grief would visit her door, from which 3 funerals would depart, and that this would occur within the next 6 weeks. Fearful, Susanna confided in her lodger, Mary Newton, advising her of this dark prophecy, and to the 2 ladies' horror, just 2 weeks later, it appeared the fortune-teller's prediction had come true. In mid-April, Susanna's husband Matthew and son William fell ill, quickly followed by Mary Newton's 15-week-old daughter. Frightened by the prophecy, Susanna strove to nurse her family back to health. She prepared them a meal of water gruel, which is basically water and oats. She stayed at their bedsides and bathed their brows as her patients complained of pain in the stomach, which was followed by vomiting and diarrhea. They writhed in agony, and the baby's cries pierced the air, until her weeping became weak and hoarse. With their conditions worsening, Susanna called for the doctor, who attended to the trio, and gave them medicine to relieve their pain. But this did little to help them, leaving Susanna and Mary to look on helplessly as their loved ones descended into more agonizing sickness. 4 days and nights of pain, their patients' bodies weak, their skin pale and clammy. The exhausted women continued to try to comfort them, but their efforts would prove fruitless. First, Susanna's husband Matthew began to convulse uncontrollably, and before the doctor could be sent for, he passed away. Just 6 hours later, Susanna held the body of her 8-year-old son William, who had also succumbed to the sickness. 15-week-old Anne Newton continued to fight, her little body ravaged by the sickness, her eyes dull, her cheeks ashen, and her cries barely audible. This strong little girl would, however, lose her battle a week after she fell ill. Given that the 3 individuals had become ill and had died around the same time, the bodies were examined to ascertain the exact cause of death. The surgeon found that Matthew Holroyd's stomach was inflamed and gangrene had set in. Tests of fluids found in the stomach were carried out, with the results showing a presence of arsenic. It was upon this finding that Susanna was charged with the murders of all 3 victims. The grieving mother and widow broke down and confessed, yet she insisted that she was only responsible for the death of her husband, whom had been her intended target. She suggested that it was Matthew, who must have given some of the gruel to their son William, and to the 15-week-old baby, and that is how they too succumbed to the poison. In September of 1816, 5 months after the murders, Susanna was brought to trial at Lancaster Assizes, where she would face 3 counts of murder. The case relied on witness testimony and the results of the post-mortem examinations. Amongst those called to testify was John Taylor. He owned a chemist in the town and recalled that the day before the 3 victims fell ill, Susanna Holroyd had visited his shop in search of a remedy to rid her home of rats and mice. She advised she wished to buy some mercury, which was in them days the common name for arsenic, and was utilised for a multitude of purposes, including rodent poison. John Taylor advised that he initially denied her request, as she did not have someone to support her reason, that he could not sell the product without someone vouching for her. Susanna left the shop, and later that day she returned with a neighbour who corroborated the need for the arsenic due to a vermin infestation. This satisfied the chemist, and he sold Susanna 1.5 ounces of arsenic. Just to give you some perspective, 140 to 1400 milligrams is considered to be a lethal dose for a healthy adult. Susanna purchased roughly 3 times the lethal dose. The mother of 15-week-old Anne Newton took to the stand next. Mary advised that she had come to stay at the couple's home some 12 weeks prior to the deaths, as Susanna was to act as a nursemaid to her daughter while Mary was at work. It was known locally that Susanna would often nurse children that were deemed to be illegitimate. It was this that had led to Mary dwelling in their property. Mary recalled that Susanna had told her 2 weeks prior to the murders about the prophecy from the fortune teller, and that this had caused some alarm. The witness then proceeded to disclose the days in which the 3 individuals were ill. She observed Susanna give her husband some gruel, and heard him objecting to the taste, protesting that his wife had put pepper in the food. Susanna proceeded to deny this, and insisted he drank the mixture, with a threat that if he didn't eat it, then it would be the last meal she would cook for him while he lived. Mary recollected Matthew Holroyd falling ill, stating that it occurred shortly after he had eaten the meal. He complained of a burning sensation in his abdomen, and within the day, 8-year-old William had the same complaint. The witness then struggled to speak of the excruciating pain that the father and son suffered in their final days, and her feelings of helplessness as her baby became increasingly ill, finding herself unable to soothe her or bring her some relief from the sickness. Mary also contradicted the claim that the house was at the time infested with mice and rats, stating that this was not the case, meaning there was no justification for the purchase of the arsenic. The doctor who had been called to assist the sick at the home reiterated the severe pain that they were enduring, and that he witnessed the patients having convulsions. John Swindle continued to explain that while he tended to the sufferers, he gave them medicine which eased their symptoms a little, but he was dismayed to learn that on subsequent visits, Susanna had not been administering the medicine to the trio, and as such, their conditions declined rapidly. Jonathan Haig took to the stand to testify regarding the examination of the bodies, reflecting on the findings of inflammation in the stomach, which was determined was not the cause of death, and that this was the result of arsenic poisoning. Throughout the proceedings it was noted that Susanna remained calm and stone-faced, revealing very little emotion. This was noted by others in the court and reported as her being, quote, insensible to her awful situation. When she took the stand, she spoke without a quiver in her voice as she defended herself. Susanna alleged that it was Matthew who had instructed her to go and purchase the arsenic, and she claimed, quote, what he did with it I cannot pretend to say. At the close of the trial, Susanna Holroyd was found guilty on 3 counts of murder, and she initially seemed unmoved by this finding. Yet when she was led away from the dock, she rested her head in front of her, and she was difficult to remove from the courtroom. Perhaps this was because she now knew what fate lay ahead of her, as 3 days after being found guilty, she would make her way to the scaffold erected outside Lancaster Assizes, in an area known as Hanging Corner. At midday on Monday the 16th of September 1816, Susanna had the noose placed about her neck, and her death sentence was carried out, making her one of 9 women to be hanged at Lancaster Assizes during that century. Following this, her body was removed, and it was to be used by medical practitioners. This was in accordance with the Murder Act of 1752, which decreed that the body of a murderer can be used in scientific dissections. This was deemed at the time to be a deterrent with which to prevent people from committing murder. However, by 1832, the act was abolished. It is hard to comprehend what drove Susanna to commit the crime. She did confess to placing the arsenic in her husband's food, following an argument, and there was rumours at the time that she was having an extramarital affair. But she went to her death never admitting to causing the deaths of her son William or her lodger's daughter Anne. I could find no mention of any potential insurance payouts Susanna may have received on the event of her husband's death, and nothing to corroborate the rumours that Susanna was having an affair. Residents of the town did not have any sympathy for Susanna when she was condemned to the scaffold, obviously due to the nature of the crime she had committed. However, as stated earlier, Susanna Holroyd was known to care for a number of illegitimate or abandoned babies, and gossip soon turned to suspicion when it was learned that since January the previous year there had been at least 7 deaths in the home. To quell the rumours, the bodies of these infants were exhumed, and testing revealed that they too had succumbed to the effects of arsenic poisoning. However, the perpetrator had already been convicted and her death sentence carried out, so no further action could be taken. Over the following decades, the dreadful deeds of Susanna Holroyd passed out of the minds of the residents of Ashton, but the town continued to grow. By the end of the century, there was about 70 mills in the town, and the area became an important part of the cotton industry. The Fisher and Jackson mill once stood on Lee Street, and many of the houses in its shadow were occupied by its workforce. In 1885, the Britland family moved on to Turner Street, which lay just a block away from the mill. Mary Ann and Thomas Britland had been married for 20 years and had 2 daughters, 19-year-old Elizabeth Hannah and 16-year-old Susanna. It is reported that 44-year-old Thomas worked as a carter, which involved transporting goods. He also worked as a waiter in a local pub. Their youngest daughter, Susanna, had gone to live and work as a domestic servant, while Mary and their eldest daughter, Elizabeth, found employment at the Fisher and Jackson mill, where they worked as reelers. While working at the mill, Mary Ann became acquainted with Thomas and Mary Dixon, a couple who also worked there, and they lived opposite them on Turner Lane. The 2 couples were often seen socialising and appeared to have a good relationship. People noted that Thomas Dixon would often be seen frequenting the Britland home. The wet winter months at the beginning of 1886 caused the dirt roads to become muddy tracks. Inside the houses, the fires were used to heat not only food but the homes. But this warmth and the absence of food due to the bitter weather led to an infestation of rats in the Britland home. And in February, Mary Ann visited the chemist to purchase a pack of Harrison's vermin killer, which contained strychnine and arsenic, with the intention of ridding her home of the rats. However, on the 8th of March, Mary Ann returned to the chemist to acquire some more of the vermin killer, but this time it was not rodents that would suffer from its effects. That evening the family retired to bed. Their eldest daughter, Elizabeth Hannah, was a picture of good health as she wished her parents good night. Yet before the sun rose the next morning, the 19-year-old was gripped by bouts of vomiting and diarrhoea. Her condition declined rapidly, with her suffering from violent convulsions. The girl was in immense pain throughout the day, and as night fell her sickness worsened. Her mother sat at her bedside, holding her daughter's hand, the beads of perspiration on Elizabeth's face glistening in the flickering candlelight. Then her body began to twitch. Starting with her fingers, it radiated through her arms until her body began to shake uncontrollably. When the convulsions stopped, Elizabeth's life ended also. Upon her passing, Dr. Thompson, who had attended to the patient, recorded the death as being caused by the symptoms of the sickness. These included convulsions and vomiting, which had resulted in heart spasms. At the end of April, the grieving couple sat down for their evening meal, lovingly prepared by Mary Ann. They then retired to bed for the night. Yet as with their daughter, Mary Ann's husband, Thomas, was awoken from his sleep with excruciating abdominal cramps. He too began to suffer the same symptoms that Elizabeth Hannah had previously endured. But within 24 hours his condition appeared to improve, with his dutiful wife lingering at his bedside throughout his sickness. Thomas, although still weakened, went to work on the Monday, and while he was gone, Mary Ann ran a number of errands. She did the laundry, went shopping, and prepared the evening meal, ready for when her husband returned from work. And then a familiar pattern started once more. Thomas sat down and enjoyed the meal. Still tired from being ill and having worked all day, he headed off to bed, but was once again disturbed in the early hours by the severe stomach cramps he had endured just 2 nights before. He would endure the agonizing cramps, vomiting and convulsion for another 3 days, before passing away on the 3rd of May, almost 2 months after his daughter. Unlike with Elizabeth, Thomas was not visited by Dr. Thompson, as a different medical practitioner was called to attend to the patient. This doctor recorded Thomas's cause of death as epilepsy. Whether by coincidence or design, the fact that the deceased had not been seen by the same doctor prevented any suspicions regarding the nature of the deaths. After losing her husband and daughter within a couple of months of each other, Mary Ann sought solace in her friends the Dixons, who took her into their home, which they already shared with Mrs. Dixon's father and her younger sister. However, the couple were happy to offer the widow comfort and helped her with the funeral arrangements. But it seemed that the spectre of death had followed Mary Ann, when on the 13th of May, just 10 days after the demise of her husband, Mary Ann's friend Mrs. Dixon fell ill. She would rapidly decline, and within a day she succumbed to the sickness. Dr. Thompson attended the Dixon house, but this time his suspicions were aroused by the striking similarities between the death of Mrs. Dixon and that of Elizabeth Britland. A suspicion that was echoed by the woman who had been sent to prepare the bodies for burial. She had noticed that in both women their hands had been clenched tightly, and there was a strange discoloration around their necks. An investigation into the death of Mrs. Dixon was quickly ordered, and a coroner was summoned to examine the body. During the post-mortem, he discovered traces of strychnine, which led to the conclusion that the deceased had been the victim of poison. Upon these findings, Mary Ann Britland and Mr. Dixon were arrested on suspicion of murder, with one newspaper reporting, quote, "On Friday afternoon, Thomas Dixon was arrested on warrant charged that he did feloniously aid and abet, counsel and procure Mary Ann Britland to commit the crime of poisoning Mary Dixon, his wife." And another publication reported on Mary Ann Britland, describing her as a, quote, "respectable looming woman, a widow. Her husband died a short time ago." From these early reports it was believed by many that Mary Ann had been an accomplice and had assisted Mr. Dixon in the murder of his wife, further fueling rumours that the pair had been having an affair and had killed Mrs. Dixon in order to be together. It was, however, the doctor who had attended to both Mrs. Dixon and Elizabeth Britland that questioned the circumstances, noting that he had found similarities between the deaths of both individuals, and had suspicions regarding Mary Ann's involvement. Due to his concerns, it was decided that an inquest should be held, following the exhumation of the bodies of Mr. Britland and his daughter Elizabeth. The request to exhume the remains was granted by the Home Secretary, and a full investigation began. Upon the exhumation of the bodies, Arthur Britland, who was the brother of Thomas, was asked to identify the deceased, and he confirmed that they were the remains of his brother and niece. Conducting the post-mortem at the mortuary within the town hall was pathologist Dr. Harris, assisted by Dr. Hamilton. The two men worked on identifying the cause of death for the father and daughter. Post-mortem would reveal that the deceased each had traces of poison in their system, and it was concluded that they had been unlawfully killed. These findings were presented to an inquest, and after reviewing all the evidence, the decision was made on what charges should be made against Mary Ann Britland and Mr. Dixon. Addressing Mr. Dixon, Alderman Walker, the Mayor and Overseer of Proceedings, stated, quote, "Thomas Dixon, the magistrates have had a great deal of trouble considering your case. We have studied the law with the advice of the clerk to see whether you are an accessory before or after the fact, and after due consideration, we may say that the magistrates do not think there is sufficient evidence to incriminate you at present. But in discharging you, I may say it does not relieve you if any further evidence transpires put you upon your trial, the same as if we had committed you today. At present, you will be discharged." After confirming that all charges regarding the deaths of his wife and Mr. Britland had been dropped against Mr. Dixon, attention then turned to Mary Ann, with the Mayor being asked what charges, if any, would be placed upon her. The magistrate's clerk recorded that Mary Ann would be charged with the murders of both individuals, and noted, quote, "Mary Ann Britland was then charged with having, on the 14th of May, feloniously, wilfully, and with malice aforethought, killed and murdered one Mary Dixon, and in reply to the usual questions, she said she had nothing to say. She was then charged in the same form with having murdered her husband, Thomas Britland, on the 3rd of May. She again replied that she had nothing to say." Following this hearing, Mary Ann Britland was then sent to await trial at Strangeways Prison in Manchester, and preparations for the court case were begun. The trial commenced in July 1886 and was presided over by Mr. Justice Cave at Manchester Assizes. Numerous witnesses were called forth to testify, with the focus initially being on the death of Mrs. Dixon. The prosecution presented the theory that the defendant had poisoned Mrs. Dixon in order to be with Mr. Dixon. Amongst those who took to the stand was Mr. Lewis Wolfenden, the father of Mrs. Dixon, who had been living with his daughter and son-in-law at the time of her death. Mr. Wolfenden advised the court that he had retired to bed no later than 11 p.m, and was woken an hour later by cries of pain coming from Mrs. Dixon's room. The concerned father proceeded to check on her and discovered she was being attended to by Mary Britland and his youngest daughter, who were applying a warm cloth to Mrs. Dixon's forehead. They were then joined by Mr. Dixon, who had gone to make some tea for the patient. Mr. Wolfenden explained that his daughter was in considerable pain and was doubled over, clenching her abdomen and writhing around in great discomfort. He described how he left the room and returned at about 4 a.m. to find his daughter's condition had improved slightly, but he noticed that her limbs were trembling and she asked him to hold her hands, which he did for about 10 minutes before leaving her to rest for a couple of hours. When he returned at 6 a.m, Mrs. Dixon's condition had declined rapidly. She was still trembling and her face had grown extremely pale. The witness then told the court that he stayed at his daughter's bedside until she passed away. When questioned about the relationship between Mrs. Britland and Mrs. Dixon, the grieving father recalled that there appeared to be no ill feelings between the two women, and he was unaware of any reason why the defendant would wish to cause his daughter harm. As a resident at the home where Mrs. Dixon died, Mr. Wolfenden was asked if he had seen any evidence of vermin at the property, which would have given Mrs. Britland reason to purchase the poison. He stated that he had not seen any vermin, nor had he noticed any of the rat poison previously at the home. The court also heard from Mrs. Sarah Lord, an acquaintance of the Dixon family. She had arrived at the family home on the 14th of May to assist in preparing Mrs. Dixon's body. When asked if she had noticed anything untoward while attending to the deceased, Mrs. Lord recalled that Mrs. Dixon had died with her hands clenched tightly into a fist. She was also lying on sheets that were damp with perspiration. This did not unnerve her, however. She was taken aback by the defendant's insistence that the body needed to be washed quickly before stiffness of the limbs set in, which made the witness slightly suspicious. Dr. Charles Thompson had been the physician called to attend to Mrs. Dixon. He testified that it was Mr. Dixon who had sent the instruction for him to come to the home, with guidance that his wife had fallen ill with severe abdominal pains. Dr. Thompson arrived at the property shortly after 1 a.m. and he assessed the patient. After assessing the patient, he proceeded to prescribe a homeopathic mixture of belladonna and colocynth to relieve Mrs. Dixon of what he believed was a severe bout of colic. When asked if he had witnessed the patient suffer from any convulsions during his visit, the doctor responded that he did not, nor was this raised as a concern by any of those in the house that night. The court then heard from Amos Perry, who worked for the insurance company who had supplied a policy for Mrs. Dixon. In his testimony, the insurance agent advised that he was visited at his office on the 14th of May by Mr. Dixon, who came to inform him that his wife, Mrs. Dixon, had passed away, and he had come to inquire about her life insurance policy. Mr. Perry recalled that he returned to the home of Mr. Dixon, where he met the defendant, Mrs. Britland, who took a keen interest in the purpose of his visit. He proceeded to explain to Mr. Dixon and Mrs. Britland that this had been the third death on the same street, and he pointed out that it was possibly something that needed to be looked into further, to which Mrs. Britland asked what business it was of anyone else, in a defensive manner. Mr. Perry concluded his testimony by stating that a total of £19 was paid out to Mr. Dixon. Attention turned to the deaths of Mr. Britland and his daughter Elizabeth, with the jury being advised that these deaths were a result of greed and lust on the part of the defendant. Speculation was put forth that perhaps Elizabeth had become aware of an affair between her mother and Mr. Dixon, and was killed to silence her. It was also highlighted that Mrs. Britland had received an insurance payout after both deaths, and that by making herself a widow, she was free to be with Mr. Dixon. The allegation of an affair was strengthened by testimony from witnesses claiming that they had seen the pair together on numerous occasions, and this formed the foundation for the prosecution's bid to discredit Mrs. Britland's character. However, Mr. Dixon argued that he loved his wife and had not dishonoured his wedding vows. To further undermine her reputation, Arthur Britland, the brother of Thomas, took to the stand to recount on how he learned of his siblings' passing, stating that he had not been aware that his niece nor his brother had been taken ill, and advising the court that when he asked Mary Ann why she hadn't told him of this fact, she replied that she did not have the time to notify him. Arthur also explained that it was only when Mary Ann, accompanied by Mr. Dixon, arrived at his home to collect money which belonged to his brother, that he was made aware of Thomas's passing. He proceeded to tell the court that his relationship with Mary Ann was strained, and concluded by stating that, quote, "I had not been on speaking terms with her for years, through her bad conduct." Further witnesses were called to confirm that Mrs. Britland had purchased the rat poison, which the prosecution argued was used as the murder weapon. On the subject of the poison, an expert witness, Charles Harrison, was called to provide testimony related to the product Mary Ann was alleged to have used to commit the murders. Harrison, who manufactured the rat poison purchased by the accused, was able to advise the trial that the product contained large quantities of strychnine and arsenic, which was mixed with rice, flour and dye. This testimony was added to by the statements made by Mr. Charles Estcourt, a scientist who specialised in analytical chemistry, and provided the court with a detailed description of his findings upon examining the organs of the deceased. He noted that by using the technique perfected by James Marsh, he was able to determine that all 3 victims had arsenic present in their organs. Having used the Marsh apparatus to discover evidence of poison, Mr. Estcourt explained that he also carried out experiments to determine how deadly the amount of arsenic found in his small sample could have been. In one experiment, he gave a mouse a 1/100th of a gram of strychnine, which resulted in the creature dying within 2 minutes. He gave a smaller sample to another mouse and recorded that the rodent survived for 20 minutes after consuming the poison. In his final test, he placed a tiny sample on the back of a frog and assessed its reaction, noting that the amphibian began to suffer from convulsions, which lasted on and off for nearly 12 hours. This proved to be a powerful piece of evidence which helped the jury to visualise just how deadly the doses were that were administered to the 3 victims. Having been presented with all the evidence, the jury were faced with a difficult decision, to the extent that during their deliberation, the members of the jury sent a communication advising that they were unable to determine the defendant's guilt, with the foreman advising that their issue was the fact there had been 3 people in contact with the victims who could have potentially administered the dose. However, over the course of several hours of debate, they were finally able to reach consensus. They found Mary Ann Britland guilty of the murders of her husband, Thomas Britland, her eldest daughter Elizabeth, and Mrs. Mary Dixon. As had occurred with Susanna Holroyd 70 years earlier, Mary Britland was sentenced to death by hanging, and faced the gallows at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. While awaiting her punishment, an appeal was made to the Home Secretary requesting a reprieve, and as she awaited the decision, Mary Britland was visited by a number of family and friends. However, no reprieve was granted, with the Home Secretary ruling that her penalty could be carried out. Newspaper reports covering the execution commented on how the prisoner pleaded for God's forgiveness as she was led to the gallows, and that in the hours prior to her sentence being carried out, she allegedly confessed to the murder of Mrs. Dixon. And although she did not openly confess to the murders of her husband and daughter, it was claimed that her demeanour was that of someone filled with guilt and remorse. The actions of these 2 women have long since faded from the knowledge of the residents of the town. There are few who will know of their deeds, or the names of their victims. There are many infamous cases of poisoning from the 1800s, which led to debates on the ease at which someone could acquire these deadly substances. Following Mary Britland's trial, the jury issued a proclamation to the court in which they stated, quote, that in the opinion of this jury, the facilities for the bale of vermin killer powders, as now regulated by the law, are highly objectionable and dangerous to human life, and we consider that more stringent regulations should be adopted, and we request that this presentment be forwarded to the Home Secretary. Despite the Arsenic Act of 1851, which compelled chemists to ensure they kept a record of who purchased the compound, for what purpose, and the quantities, it would not be until the Pharmacy Act of 1868 that more stringent measures were put in place to control the ease at which someone could purchase hazardous substances. So thank you for joining me for today's episode of It's Murder Up North. The next episode will be available in 2 weeks. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.